Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar as part of the Changing Cities, Shaping Sustainable Futures webinar series hosted by ICLEI Africa. My name is Paul Curry, and I'm utterly inviting you into this conversation today on future-proofing urban mobility, exploring routes to resilience. The thing about this discussion today is that it's bridging a number of projects across the continent where we'll hear about how to reduce vehicle emissions in the city of Johannesburg, about e-mobility considerations in Rwanda, and about mobility planning in the 6th of October city in Egypt. This is brought to you in partnership with Rise Africa, which is inspiring action for sustainable cities, as well as African Mobility Month, which is directing or exciting people to their actions around mobility, as well as the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, for which ICLEI Africa is the secretariat. A little bit about African Mobility Month is really about transforming, click on your screen, is about transforming urban mobility in Africa. And you can participate in this through 5 key ways: sharing recent reports, papers, case studies, facts, all sorts of strategies about urban mobility in Africa. Show us how you're transforming urban mobility through images shared on Twitter and Instagram about what your city or you are doing for mobility in the city. Host and participate in happenings and events throughout the month. Celebrate the people and organizations who are pushing mobility forward in Africa, and then mobilize your networks to join the campaign using the hashtag African Mobility Month. This is running from the 17th of September to October, and this is one of the webinars which form a part of it. We'd also, in our discussion tomorrow, hosted with JPI Urban Europe and START to explore the concept of the 15-minute city and what this might offer for our thinking about driving urban transitions. So from everyone in the session, please do rename yourself to have your name and organization or name in your city. And please do share a bit about what interests you about urban mobility in the chat, as well as any questions to our provocateurs throughout the session. Just to let you know, we are recording the session, so by participating, you're consenting to be recorded, and that ensures that we can share the inputs from this discussion with further registrants. So I'd like to now invite my colleague Jahan Biku, who's going to guide us through this conversation, to introduce our other speakers and provocateurs, and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, Jahan.
Thanks so much, Paul. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Jahan Biku, and I'm a professional officer in the Urban Systems Unit at ICLEI Africa. And so in today's webinar, we'll be exploring sort of what future-proof mobility really looks like. What does it entail, and sort of reflect on some of the key entry points that could make mobility systems now and in the future more resilient to future shocks and stresses and crises and challenges that we may be facing. And this has really come about because, you know, as we've witnessed during the COVID pandemic, and really how it is shaped and changed our cities and our systems, just how vulnerable mobility and transport systems are in African cities. And so really disrupting normal functioning of our cities, as well as impacting on people, the citizens, as well as just the way our cities are changing and how people have access to these systems. And so some of the impacts that we've really seen is around changing travel demand and travel patterns, and how this has impacted overall operations. And what we've seen in the way this has developed is it's really impacted on fares and how the affordability of public transport, and really then impacting on access for people that really depend on these systems. Another aspect is that it's really reduced the supply, and this has really impacted on how citizens and the people who are most reliant on these systems, how they are able to access. And as we've witnessed, alternative options are also very limited in our cities. Impacting the lives and livelihoods of people, as well as having the potential to increase car use, which is something we need to, we look as we go into the future, looking at shifting and changing. And so as our cities, and as our cities are facing the threat of natural disasters, that's also one of the aspects that could be potentially impacting on our mobility systems. And so with climate change being exacerbated and environmental disasters and impacts and challenges, how this would also disrupt operations. And so really thinking from now and in the future, as we transition and as we look at adapting and transforming our mobility systems, what are the challenges that we need to face? How are we dealing with rapidly growing urban populations, and how this will increase the need of mobility and the need for transportation and allow people to move. So really thinking about how our systems need to endure and adapt to these crises and challenges in the future, but also how, while we're thinking of this, how this addresses climate change, climate impacts, air pollution, road fatalities, and also most importantly, how our mobility systems of the future really promote equity and social justice and inclusion and access, and how these multimodal systems would be integrated. So we'll be showcasing some of these elements and key entry points through 3 projects, as Paul has mentioned. So the first one would be the City of Johannesburg Vehicle Emissions Control Strategy, which will be presented by Tara Caetano. She's a professional officer in the Climate Change, Energy and Resilience workstream at ICLEI Africa, as well as the coordinator for the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. We'll then head over to Accelerating E-Mobility in Rwanda, which will be presented by Benjamin Konia, who heads the Africa office at Carbon Trust, as well as Natasha Ndahiro, who's a projects analysis specialist at FNEWA. And the last but not least, going through the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, 6th of October City in Cairo, which will be presented by Abdurrahman Higetsi, who is the co-founder and research associate at the Transport for Cairo. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague Tara, who will take us through the process and development of the Vehicle Emissions Control Strategy. Tara, you may share your screen, put on your video.
Great.
And maybe before we get started, if there's any questions, please put it in the chat box. Please put it in the Q&A, and we will address them throughout the webinar. Thanks. Over to you, Tara.
Great. Thanks, Jahan. And good afternoon or good evening, good morning to everyone on this exciting webinar. As Jahan mentioned, I'm going to be taking you through some of the work that was done with the City of Johannesburg. As ICLEI Africa, we supported them with developing their vehicle emissions control strategies. One of the first fully fledged developed vehicle emissions control strategy in Africa. So it was really a delight to work with the City of Johannesburg team. The City of Johannesburg is also a signatory to the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa initiative. And I'm also just going to pop the link to the website of COMSA in the chat in case you want to find out more about it. But we, as also another hat, I'm coordinator of the Secretariat of the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. We support local governments across the Sub-Saharan African region in various areas of sustainability, climate change, and energy. So more specifically with this work that was conducted with the City of Johannesburg, I'm going to start off here with a very brief overview. This is the great infographic that was almost the main output of this work. But I'm going to take you through the process of how we went from the actual problem to doing the deep analysis to then communicating it through this great sort of infographic. So I'm not spending too much time here. I'm going to leave you hanging and ready to look at it in more deep depth at the end of this presentation. So vehicle emissions, and why was this an important area for the City of Johannesburg to look at, and why is it an important area for a number of our cities in Africa, especially those that are having very high rates of urbanization at the moment. Why is this an area of importance to consider? The city of Johannesburg had completed their air quality management plan. And one of the main recommendations of the air quality management plan was for them to look into more depth around the situation to do with vehicle emissions. This was one of the main sources of emissions for the city. And one of the recommendations from their air quality management plan was to look in more detail into what these vehicle emissions were, where they were coming from, and how they could possibly develop interventions that could counter the increase in these vehicle emissions. So the first reason why the vehicle emissions were so high in the city of Johannesburg, and this is not unfamiliar to a number of cities in sub-Saharan Africa, is the use of secondhand or older vehicles. But there's also an affordability aspect of this. Unfortunately, the secondhand older vehicles are also the more affordable options, and vehicles with reduced efficiency and they're generating more emissions obviously has a negative impact on emissions, but also has a very positive impact in terms of livelihoods and creating the space and ability for people to travel around the city and to get to work, etc. So there's a huge trade-off there, but one of the main reasons why we have these significant vehicle emissions in the city of Joburg was the use of these second-hand and older vehicles. The second reason is the limited transport infrastructure that currently exists. So in terms of public transport, the city of Johannesburg has a plan to really improve their transport infrastructure and has done so through various initiatives such as the Rio Via, which is their bus rapid transport system that they're implementing. But at this point, there's still a huge reliance on private vehicles, which again generate more emissions. The third main cause, and is because they have lack of data, or the data is actually inadequately collated and monitored. So there's some serious discrepancies in terms of where these emissions are actually emitted from, who is emitting them, etc. And this is really hindering their ability to develop policies and interventions that can really affect change within the city. There's also, we found, a lack of public awareness programs and incentives that encourage people to move to non-motorized transport options and also the public transport options. So there's this general perception in the public that these forms of transport are unsafe, and also just not enough awareness about the importance of choosing these options above motorized transport options. So the process that we followed that could be mimicked in other regions of Africa, and I think I just want to highlight these 3 points because they really supported us in driving a very successful process with the city of Johannesburg. The first was the stakeholder engagement, and here I put internal as well as external. What we also found, and which was really at the heart of this work with our colleagues at City of Johannesburg, was they wanted to go along this journey with all the other departments within their city. They realized that vehicle emissions and developing vehicle emission control strategies really went across different directorates within the city. So they wanted it to be a joint initiative with each of the departments that exist within the city, so that it could really be owned by the city as a whole and not just a single department in that. And I think that was really key to the success of this particular strategy. But also externally, there are a number of public interests that are involved within the vehicle emissions space. And it was important to also, again, have a responsibility and ownership from them within the strategy. So the stakeholder engagement component, I think, including the internal and the external, is key to success in terms of this type of process. The second, or one of the key components of work under this particular project, was the technical modeling exercise. It was really a significant modeling exercise that led to the results being evidence-based. Although there was a significant challenge when it came to data constraints. As I already mentioned, there was a lack in terms of the data that was collected on vehicles in the city of Johannesburg. But also what was key to this process was identifying these challenges and exactly where the data challenges existed, so that the city and also the authorities that exist around the city that collect the data could also understand, what data would be useful to inform this kind of exercise in the future. So I think, as much as the challenges really hindered the modeling at some points, it was also important to really pinpoint exactly where the data was needed to improve work within the space. And then the third component is around communication and visibility. And what I showed you earlier in terms of that infographic, it's just one component of the communications, but also for a very important point for a city or local government to consider when they're developing a strategy that they're wanting to implement, is who they want to communicate it to, and how are they going to create visibility on this particular strategy to support them in the implementation of it. So a lot of discussions around appropriate communication and visibility for this particular project. So I thought what would be of interest is to dig a little bit deeper into the technical modeling exercise that was followed. There were two main objectives of the technical modeling exercise. The first one was to estimate the amount and the composition of vehicle emissions in the city of Johannesburg. And we used 2019 as the base year, since that was the year that we had most data. And the second objective was to model the impact of various interventions compared to a baseline scenario, so that we could see what the trade-offs were in terms of emissions. We used a tool called the copa tool. It's known as the tool in terms of EU standards for vehicle emissions. And it uses multiple inputs, so it's a very flexible tool in terms of the kind of data that you have. It's also a tool that's published and peer-reviewed, so it's really well known as one that is robust for this particular type of work, and also includes all main pollutants that you could be interested in when looking particularly at vehicle emissions. A point I also wanted to make about the copa tool here is you can see that it's very well used in Europe, but our hope is also through this type of work to create some visibility about the tool and its benefits for the use in local governments in the African region, and really to increase its use in Africa. As you can see, only 3% of the users of this tool are in Africa. But I think also as the transport sector, particularly from an emissions perspective, becomes more and more relevant, we'll probably see this use in Africa go up quite a lot. So what are some of the interventions that we modeled? And these are particularly interventions that came out through research, research into the policies and strategies that already existed for the city of Johannesburg, but also through the stakeholder consultation. So what are potential interventions that we could look at for the city of Johannesburg to improve the vehicle emissions situation? And these interventions that we identified, the first one being decreased daily mileage, the second one, congestion charges, then high occupancy vehicle lanes, optimal low emission zones, compliance with stricter vehicle emission standards, and then also reduction in the high emitters. And we had our hypotheses in terms of which ones would be the highest impact, but what we did was really use the copa model to inform these, well, we used the COPA model as a simulation tool so that we could put in these different scenarios and then compare them against each other in a robust and consistent way. So I think for the purposes here, what's most interesting is looking at the technical modeling results and where the most impact was really found. So you'll see here, these were where the most impacts were found. So compliance with stricter emissions reduction standards. We saw a lot of impact in terms of a number of greenhouse gas emissions categories, and then also the optimal low emission zones. So the two take homes here, and this is particularly for the city of Johannesburg, so it would be interesting for whichever municipality or city you represent, for you to do a similar exercise to see what would be the sort of best or higher impact scenarios within your city. But what we found for the city of Johannesburg was compliance with stricter emissions reduction standards. It relatively had the highest impact compared to the other scenarios that we had. And then also the introduction of optimal low emission zones. So these were low emission zones where we saw there was quite a big density in terms of emissions. So particularly within the center of the city, within the Johannesburg CBD, to have these low emission zones could really have a large impact across the board in terms of all different types of pollutants. So as I promised, we're back on the infographic. So a few take homes from what I've just presented. The city of Johannesburg knew that they had to look at a deep evidence base for why their vehicle emissions were so significant, what really was the cause of these emissions, and in order to come up with a prioritized list of interventions that they could then take forward, they then used the COPA model, which was peer reviewed and well recognized, etc., to look at the deep into a deep analysis of all the different scenarios of interventions that they could follow. Data was an issue, but one that we did overcome, and I think has also had the effect of the city of Johannesburg also realize exactly where the data gaps are, so they can improve on that over the next few years. And also through this work, they now have some key interventions that they're working with a number of stakeholders on, including those internal in the city, to drive forward and really improve the situation in terms of vehicle emissions within the city. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Tara. That's very, very interesting and very exciting. I just want to ask whoever, if anyone has any questions, to please pose it in the chat box. I do have one for you before we go on to the next one. So, I mean, you've mentioned quite a bit around stakeholder engagement and how important that is for the strategy. And I know, you know, with a lot of these sort of interventions, it requires multi-stakeholder, cross-government inputs. What are some of the approaches that you used or methods that you used to understand sort of the legislative landscape and the people involved, and then assigning, you know, who to get everyone on board and the buy-in?
Great, thanks so much for that question. So indeed, I mean, mapping the actual stakeholder landscape was really critical. We as a sort of first point of call, really relied on our colleagues at the City of Johannesburg to identify exactly who they thought would be key and critical within this particular project. And then secondly, in all the analysis of the different policies and strategies that existed within this particular topic, that also gave us a good grasp of exactly who could be useful to include within these conversations. And then I think, you know, the mix of group and also bilateral conversations really supported the work that we had. Sometimes if you're in a situation where you have a large group that you're having a workshop with, it's difficult to get that input from everyone on all sides and to really read the room. So I think, you know, in terms of stakeholder engagement, it's really critical to use a blend of both bilateral conversations where you're reaching out directly, as well as the group settings where you're having more of the discussion between a number of stakeholders. I think that really helped within our work. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We have a question, just one more question actually. We have one from Marcel that speaks about the vehicle pollution. Much of the vehicle pollution on Johannesburg is also caused by vehicles and trucks moving through the city to major parts of the country. This does not seem to be included in the model. How did we go about sort of including the different kinds of vehicles, and what was the sort of challenges around that?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. What I didn't go through was exactly what the vehicle park, or, you know, the types of vehicles that we were including in this analysis. And indeed, a lot of the vehicles within this particular study were trucks and were sort of heavy vehicles. But in discussions with the city of Johannesburg, we decided that this was probably outside of their realm or their mandate in terms of how to control the movement of trucks between different regions of the country. So they wanted to focus more on what they could really enact as a city. But also in terms of their sort of low emission zones that they wanted to try and look at implementing within the city. We also discussed potentially having areas where there wouldn't be allowed sort of any trucks or sort of heavy vehicles coming into these particular spaces, to also then again, you know, decrease the density of emissions. Because when it comes to vehicle emissions, it's not only the amount of emissions that are emitted, but it's also where they're emitted. So you're creating these almost these hotspots of emissions around the city that they wanted to kind of disperse a little bit. So looking at corridors where you could potentially have, you know, the trucks moving and heavy vehicles moving that were outside of places where people were working and living would be a more optimal way to look at it from the city of Joburg. So yeah, in summary, we did include trucks in the analysis, but the focus of the interventions was more on what was within the city of Johannesburg's mandate.
Thanks so much for that. I see a number of very interesting questions coming in, and I think when we get to the Q&A, we'll address some of these. But for now, I would like to hand over to Benjamin, Kunia, and Natasha and Ndairo to present the transitioning to e-mobility in Rwanda. You may share your screen.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Just bear with me momentarily whilst I find the right buttons. Okay, great. So thank you, Jahan, and thank you for this opportunity to present to colleagues. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk briefly around a concept that we've been working on, which has recently been awarded preliminary funding by something called the NAMA facility. And I'll talk a little bit about what the NAMA facility is in a moment. But really, the whole concept is around how do we accelerate the uptake of electric motorcycles and to a lesser degree kind of e-mobility more generally in Kigali and surrounding Rwanda. So I'll launch straight in. So like many countries in East Africa and indeed kind of throughout the continent, as well as in kind of Southeast Asia, motorcycles are the predominant form of transport. And in Rwanda, they represent kind of well over 50% of vehicles on the road. So you can see latest estimates in Rwanda that suggest there's about 110 110,000 motorcycles in Rwanda. And the bulk of these are used as motorcycle taxis. In Rwanda, these are called motos. In East Africa, they're more commonly known as bodas. And the same kind of picture is replicated in the capital city, Kigali, where you have around 30,000 motorcycles, of which 25,000, so the vast bulk are motos. And that market is really expected to continue. The government's own feasibility study entitled the SWECO feasibility study suggests that by 2030 there could be as many as 180,000 motorcycles on the road from the 110,000 base today. The opportunity here is around how do we scale up the potential for electric motorcycles. And really the government is really kind of aiming to, you can see there in the bottom right hand corner, they'd like to see kind of as many as 60,000 deployed. So 30% of the market deployed to electric motorcycles by 2030. And that's not far away. So the question is how do we do that? Other reasons as to why kind of they want to kind of electrify this form of transport is unsurprisingly the emissions impact, and so kind of the estimate that around kind of 3% of all emissions in Rwanda comes from kind of motorcycles. Them kind of really consume around 26% of total transport-based emissions. And the other really interesting point is, of course, that Rwanda, like many landlocked countries, doesn't have any sort of local oil and gas kind of capabilities, and so there is a kind of a need to import refined fuels, and that kind of impacts the balance of payments. So there is a real desire to wean itself from that dependency. And so kind of the government has very exciting ambitions to electrify mobility more generally, and very much kind of to start with motorcycles as a base. And I kind of touched on there the target of kind of 30% of the park by 2030. In fact, President Kagame, about a year or 18 months ago, actually called for even faster transition than that, and kind of was arguing that he would like to see kind of full electrification of the motorcycle park as early as 2025. So certainly the ambition for kind of electrification and e-mobility is very strong. So what are we talking about here? What do these things look like? The bulk of motos and the bulk of bodas in East Africa are these kind of typical 250cc motorcycles. They typically retail at around $1,800, and a number of them are manufactured locally in Rwanda and in East Africa. The parts are really kind of imported for the most part from China, and then they're locally assembled. These things are workhorses, and they cover in a lifetime around 200,000 kilometers in their lives, which means that they kind of last around kind of 2 to 3 years. So they don't last very long, but they kind of work jolly hard. Now, if you are a moto taxi driver, your take home of ferrying people and goods around Kigali is roughly $2 a day. And that's kind of what you take home after you've paid whatever finance costs you have on the bike, whatever fuel costs you will have paid for, and of course, maintenance. These things go through brake pads pretty quickly. You have to have oil changes every week, all of which has obviously kind of particulate and environmental impacts as well. So, these things are expensive to run, and the take home is not enormous. And by contrast, you see there on the right hand side, there's the kind of electric equivalent. Now, these are typically kind of run by around a 4,000 watt motor, which is equivalent to 250 cc's. So, the important thing here is that there is no decline in performance. And on the contrary, the fact that it's driven by an electric motor means you've got a nice torquey you've got a nice talky response, which is very important in a country such as Rwanda, which is very hilly. The important thing to note is that they retail likewise at around $1,800, but that doesn't include the battery. And we'll talk around that in a moment. But really, these emerging technologies are being structured in a manner that, is a comparable price point, but it doesn't include the battery. And the battery, by the way, is that gray thing there in the chassis there. It's that box. There are 3 brands presently kind of moving from commercial trials to scale up in Rwanda. They are Ampersand, they are Safi, and Rwanda Electric Motorcycle Company. But there are others also emerging in Kenya and Uganda. And likewise, the parts are imported from China. And you can see, if you look at the bikes, they look pretty similar. And that's because obviously they share quite a lot of parts. And because it's an electric bike, there's a much more, they last longer. There's fewer moving parts, so they're estimated to last 300,000 kilometers, if not more. And the crucial thing here, and the really, really important thing here, is that the commercial proposition, as it's been structured, is far more attractive than the traditional motorcycle. So based on the kind of business models that are being touted, the motor taxi driver can take home kind of between $3.5 to $4 a day. And this is actually even before the Rwandan government recently introduced revision for renewable energy tariff, which is now pegged to the industrial tariff, which is quite a bit lower than the tariff that was being paid before. So that means now that the manufacturers will be able to pass on kind of a decline and make that take home kind of even more attractive. So really the commercial proposition is what's driving this kind of opportunity. So what does this thing look like? So this is the bike, and you can see here kind of this is at a swap station. So these are battery swap technologies for the most part. 2 of the manufacturers run a battery swap model. One actually runs a fast charge model. And this is an example of a swap station. And so you see here kind of, this is a kind of a container, and the bike rolls up here, and you can see with the gray box there is the battery. Then it's pretty simple. On a little cart, you can see the battery is simply pulled out, it's wheeled into the container where it goes and gets charged, and then another one gets slotted in, and you can see there the rider behind waiting his turn. So the whole process takes kind of 2 or 3 minutes. Now, on a single charge, a bike can do around 60 to 80 Ks. These guys typically do anywhere between 120, maybe 150 Ks a day. So they're having to do at least a swap a day, if not 2. And they pay for their fuel, which involves essentially just, they pay per swap. Now, again, the clever thing here is that because, as you saw earlier, the take home and the cash flow for traditional bikes is quite low, these motorcycle taxi operators are used to really only putting in 1 liter or 2 of fuel into their bike to each fill up. So they also they will also kind of go and fill their bike up once or twice a day. So the fact that the range is that much lower is really no impact at all. It changes nothing for these individuals' working day, which is really crucial. And as I mentioned before, the company retains the ownership of the battery. So for each bike, they own kind of 2 to 3 batteries, and the depreciation cost of the battery is then included on top of the electricity that's in the battery, and the bike and the riders kind of pay for their fuel that way. And still, with obviously the depreciation cost of the battery and the electricity, it's a much more attractive proposition. Obviously, the major impact is reduction in emissions, and kind of the estimations that are available at the moment would suggest that over a life cycle basis, these bikes are typically 75% lower in terms of their carbon impacts than their kind of internal combustion engine partners or counterparts. So you can see there the opportunity here is really quite substantial to reduce overall carbon impacts. So why aren't these things kind of flying off the shelves? And there are a number of kind of key barriers that are preventing uptake, which we want to overcome through this project concept that we've pitched. And the key one and the main one here is on the left-hand side, and that is financial and economic. And there are two issues here. One is there is a lack of demand side finance, right? So how is it that these individuals, these motorcycle riders or motor taxi riders, how do they access the bike, and how do they access finance for the bike? How do they access lease finance for the bike? So there is a lack of kind of demand or asset financing for motorcycles because it's a new technology, and there's a risk of there's a risk perception attached to this technology. And then crucially, there is a lack of supply side funding, and that's on the side of the manufacturers. Manufacturers to date have been manufacturing kind of tens, maybe even hundreds of motorcycles, but as we've talked about, we need now thousands of these and the associated infrastructure. So how do they access the finance to do that? Noting that they've grown to date through equity. They need to bring on debt into their businesses, and they need the debt for working capital, for manufacturing expansion and for infrastructure expansion. But again, they don't have the track records, they don't have the collateral with which to raise traditional finance. And then there are obviously the second kind of biggest barrier is to some degree kind of policy and regulation. We've noted that the Rwandan government is very keen to see these motorcycles roll out and already actively thinking about kind of the levers that they can pull, and we've talked around the electricity tariff. But there are kind of other areas to look at. How do e-motorcycles fit into a wider understanding of e-mobility? How do they impact the rollout of future, for example, kind of electric buses and BRT systems? There's a lack of technical standards for e-motos. So these are kind of question marks which the government needs answers to in order to facilitate the rollout. So and then there are kind of other question marks around kind of the supporting infrastructure, particularly around the role of end of life clarity for batteries and for the motorcycles themselves. What's going to happen to all the old ICE bikes as well as we kind of flip the park to electric motorcycles? So we've applied to the NAMA facility for some money. Now the NAMA facility is it's a mitigation instrument. It's an international climate finance instrument, and it's a facility which is made available by the UK, German, and EU funds, as well as the Danes, I should say. And they have kind of annual or 18 monthly calls for proposals, and they are all about kind of mitigation. So unsurprisingly, the bulk of their portfolio of projects kind of is in the areas of energy efficiency and renewable energy. But increasingly, they're looking to diversify the portfolio and are very keen to see kind of transport included in that. And you can apply for 20 million euros, which needs to be split across a technical assistance package and then a financial assistance package. And those programs are up to 5 years long, but the financial instruments can last longer than that. Now, crucially, the programs must be innovative, transformational, and sustainable. And importantly, it's not an innovation fund. So in the context of this project, what's crucial is that the technology is now commercially viable, and now we need to scale up. So we're not about proof of concept, we're not about proving the technology, we're about proving mechanisms to scale up, which is exciting. So what have we proposed? Well, we've proposed a technical assistance package for $5 million, and that would do a whole load of work to work with the government in particular to understand the rollout plan, developing technology and safety standards, a roadmap to battery and e-waste recycling. So really a host of kind of enabling environment interventions, and crucially a financial assistance package, which is a multi-instrument fund, which I'll talk about in a moment. And really the aim is obviously to kind of create an environment which is supportive to the scale up of e-mobility more generally. Who's doing what in terms of this concept? Well, clearly NAMA Facilities, I've talked about, is the funder. Crucially and very importantly, this is a project which is very much owned and championed, I'm pleased to say, by the respective ministries of environment and Ministry of Infrastructure in Rwanda. They've been extremely supportive of the project concept to date, and it's thanks to them that that NAMA have agreed to fund the feasibility stage of this project.
Sorry, Ben.
Yeah.
Just because we're on, there's 3 minutes left.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. The key implementer is FNEWA, and I'm joined by my colleague Natalie, who is from the FNEWA, which is the Rwanda Green Fund. And then the key implementers of the project are the Banque Rwandaise du Développement, which is the development bank in Rwanda, and supported by us, Carbon Trust, and by colleagues from ICLE. So just a couple more slides, so I'll be quick. So this is how the funding is going to work. So we have first of all, a guarantee fund, and that is designed to address that demand side financing, which I talked about. So you underwrite the value of the motorcycle in the first instance by as much as 80%, but you ramp that down over time to 20% as the technology becomes more available, and you make that guarantee available to lease financiers so that they can access third-party commercial debt and make lease finance available to motorcycle riders. And then you have a revolving debt fund, and that is made available to commercial banks, and they can blend that debt facility with their own finances and make that money available to motorcycle manufacturers. And really, that debt that's made available from the revolving debt fund is first loss. So you take the biggest chunk of risk, and commercial banks are then kind of encouraged to crowd in their own funding for the motorcycle manufacturers. So that's really kind of what we're proposing to run over the next 10 years. We're proposing to run this fund. And the outcome that the outputs that we're looking for are as many as 40,000 motorcycles deployed. We're also proposing a funding tranche, which I haven't talked about, which will fund e-buses, but ultimately kind of benefit as many as 500,000 beneficiaries, leveraging their kind of, you can see the $120 million in private sector funding from an original ask of 18 million, resulting in 1.2 million tons of direct carbon. And then we've assumed an indirect carbon impact as well, because we assume that for every electric bike you catalyze, you're likely to see another one on the road after that. So that is really as much as I have to say about all of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. I'm going to turn to Natasha. Natasha is from FNEWA, the Rwandan Green Fund. And just to understand and to reflect on sort of what, you know, from the Rwandan government side and from the mobility aspect, what does this mean? What does this project mean for Rwanda? How does it feed into sort of the mobility plans and policies, and also just considering the post-COVID recovery and the green recovery? How does this really impact and play a role in that?
Hi, everyone. I hope you can all hear me.
You're a bit soft.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I apologize. Could you just repeat that question for me, Jahan? The internet kept going in and out.
Sorry. So just in terms of from the Rwandan government side and from FNEWA's side, what does this project sort of mean in terms of mobility plans and the policies that are being developed going forward? And also just thinking around the green recovery and the post-COVID recovery, how does this sort of feed into those plans and implementation plans going forward?
Thank you. Just to echo kind of what Benjamin said, so 52% of the public transport that's accessed by citizens is through motorcycles, and they do emit quite a bit of the pollution. And so one of the biggest goals for us in the Ministry of Environment was to find a way to deteriorate this air quality in Kigali, and the best method for that we saw was with encouraging electric mobility. I think there's two examples that were given within the presentation, Ampersand and Safi, who have been able to put this plan into action, and it worked pretty well. So for the most part, we are working very hard to remove these vehicles, but as well as increasing energy efficiency, decarbonizing the power sector, switching to electricity and other low zero carbon fuels. But it's a lot harder because I think there was a question actually in the chat box of how to encourage people to acquire these bikes, how to make the batteries more accessible, cheaper. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I got distracted by a question. But yeah, so because of that, it's been a challenge to understand the best way forward. But I think with this project specifically, it will be a lot easier to do that. Now we do have to acknowledge COVID and the slowdown that it's brought in terms of understanding, like a lot of policies and programs were in place and set to action, but we're still working to implement a lot of these projects, a lot of these policies, and really understand how they can be effective in terms of that smooth transition to full electric mobility. So the combination of COVID, the combination of a bit of the challenges we have will be interesting to tackle, but I'm confident that we can do this. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much. That's fine. I am going to switch over to the next presentation. And I think when we get to the Q&A, I will pose some of the questions that are in the chat to you during that time. Thanks so much. I will now hand over to Abdurrahman Higetsi, who will present the SUMP plan for Cairo, the 6th of October city. Thanks. You may share your screen.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. So I hope everybody can see my screen in full screen now. So yeah, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan of 6th of October City was a project we conducted during 2020 and 2021. The project was conducted by TFC as a technical implementer of the project, of the plan, and with partnership with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and UN Habitat Cairo office, and for the benefit of New Urban Communities Authority. So some background on 6th of October City. So Egypt has been trying to build new towns since the 70s to accommodate the growing population in urban areas coming from rural areas. Greater Cairo region now has over 25 million inhabitants. And they have been trying to accommodate this level of increase of population in new desert towns around the urban agglomeration of Greater Cairo. So here you can see 6th of October City on the western side of Greater Cairo region center. It was they started construction in 1979. And the numbers of population now are pretty conflicting. So the New Urban Communities Authority themselves report 1.5 million inhabitants to be living now in the city, while the 6th of October Authority, which actually affiliated to the New Urban Communities Authority, estimates the number of citizens to be 2 million inhabitants. And we have a 3 million target in 23. So yeah, the city, the new urban communities structure in terms of governance is pretty different than other old towns and rural areas in Egypt. It's a parallel governance scheme under New Urban Communities Authority, apart from the municipalities who govern the old towns, the old urban agglomeration, the historic urban agglomeration of Cairo and other cities in Egypt. And we were working with the Transport Regulatory Unit under the New Urban Communities Authority, and also the 6th of October City Development Authority, which is an executive arm of New Urban Communities Authority governing the cities, some sort of governance more than, it's not governance as much as it is real estate expansion and urban expansion plans. So we adopted the SUMP process of the European Commission the European Union developed some guideline for European cities. We try to localize the sustainable urban mobility planning process to fit the local context in Egypt to achieve a 10-year plan between 2020 and 2030. So the plan we conducted covered the first 3 steps of the SUM process, starting from the preparation phase and diagnostic of the existing state of mobility in 6th of October, then plotting the scenarios and common vision, and finally coming with a package of measures to be implemented to achieve the targets under the aforementioned vision. So yeah, the questions answered by the SUM are basically, what does the city have in terms of resources, whether it's in the city governance structure or NGOs or citizens? What are the main problems and gaps in the resources the city have? And finally, what are our options for the future? And we opt for realistic options rather than ambitious targets within the bigger scheme of things of urban expansion that is happening for sure all over Egypt. And finally, what exactly can we do with taking into consideration the scarcity of resources for local governments in Egypt, because the budgets are very centralized in the Ministry of Finance, so there's no local taxes and so on. So how to deal with this scarcity of resources to implement? And finally, the implementation phase. So basically, we start with the diagnosing how is it going for urban mobility in 6th of October City at the moment. We look at the modal share, the user experience in terms of walking and cycling and using public transportation, whether it's paratransit, which dominates the public transport sector, or formal transportation services provided by private sector or the government itself. We conducted a passenger survey for around 2,000 respondents, and we conducted a street level diagnostic of the street design elements. And finally, we conducted a comparative public transport network diagnostic to see the differences between travel times between private motorized options and public transportation. And for the future, we looked at all the plans and the laws for 6th of October City, whether it's a local plan for 6th of October City or a metropolitan level plan that will affect the city in the future. So let's start with analyzing the travel time gap for trips between 6th of October City and other major urban centers in Greater Cairo. Basically, we measure the travel time gap between private motorized modes like private cars, taxis, and Uber against the public transport modes, which includes paratransit sector and formal transportation sector. The differences in travel time is very huge, as you can see, ranging from 122% to 233% differences. Which shows a very bad user experience for public transport users in terms of travel time when we talk about metropolitan level trips. Secondly, we look at how different types of public transportation are different in terms of operation. Basically, formal transport, the formal transport sector, the big full-size buses of the Cairo Transport Authority are acting as local services. They stop many times in their way, and they provide long travel time with multiple stoppages, as you can see. While the paratransit sector acts more like an express service, starting from the starting point, from the origin, and stopping many times only near to the destination point, and actually it provides like half, on average, half of the travel time to users. So we I will go over some conclusions from the passenger survey of the 2,000 respondents. Basically, around half of the daily trips in 6 October City happen inside the city itself, while a quarter happens as long commute between the city and other parts of Greater Cairo region, and 150,000 trips as short commutes to the near Sheikh Zayed and other nearby cities. We basically look at the short commute as for the trips between 10 and 30 kilometers, and the long commutes for trips more than 30 kilometers. So the satisfaction survey showed a very different satisfaction rate for females and males regarding public transportation. I will show you now the safety and the comfort, which were the most elements that respondents in general were unsatisfied with. Basically, the satisfaction rate is very low for female respondents when compared to male respondents. And this accounts for the total or the complete user experience from walking to accessing the vehicle and walking from the vehicle from the destination, from the vehicle to the destination. Same in comfort, we can see female respondents are more dissatisfied with the current service, which is dominated by the paratransit sector, which is very efficient in terms of travel time and geographic coverage, but also it's very bad and inadequate in terms of safety and comfort level, because it's not there is no quality standards for the sector. And we ask then we ask people, the respondents, about what are the priorities for them to improve in the future. Private car owners and mass transport users actually had comfort and safety as top components in common. The difference happens in the third top component. For mass transport users, it's fare prices, affordability issues. For private car owners to shift from private cars, it's travel time. Basically, it's travel time. Network coverage is pretty good thanks to the expansive paratransit network that actually expand based on the demand. Looking at the future metropolitan level projects that will affect 6 October City, we examined all the rail and road public transport projects that will provide a better or more metropolitan accessibility to the city of 6 October. And we came with the main challenges in the city and the potentials also. So the challenge is basically it's a very bad user experience for pedestrians, because the streets are very wide, the vehicular speeds are very high, poor management of road space. On-street parking is the main parking option for private car users, and lack of mass transport intermodal integration between the intercity network and the intra-city network themselves. The potentials are basically the availability of the road space. The city is new, relatively new. The road spaces are basically the roads in the city are most of them are highways, or can be classified as highways. So we have the space without any demolition of existing buildings or so on to allocate space for different types of mobility other than private motorization. The high quality mass transport services that is coming into service in these 10 years, like the monorail lines and the metro lines, will provide a better access on a metropolitan level. And finally, the availability of space to construct new intermodal trips that will improve the user experience for public transport users. The challenges and of the growth of the city between 2020 and 2030 are basically the city will continue growing in terms of population. There is urban expansion schemes for the city, a very large urban, a very expansive urban expansion scheme to include another city called Hadai October or October Gardens, which will have like 750,000 new inhabitants. This will lead to increase in number of trips and increase of mobility demand in general. The potential challenges are overcrowding, decrease of air quality, increase of congestion because of the increase of private motorization, and all of the inequality and social segregation that comes with the streets designed for private cars and low investments in public transportation. To see how things developed in the past for the city, we can look at the model share in 2001 and in 2020. So basically, the most mode that got affected and decreased largely is active travel. Active travel, due to the expansion and the rapid expansion of the city and the highways that got through the urban fabric, is considered a worse option for people. So they tend to use vehicular options like tuk-tuks, rickshaws, or paratransit in 1 kilometer trips or so. While the dominance of the paratransit sector continued to give the upper hand for public transport in general, but 3%, just 3% in transit formal, down from 14%, or down from around, I remember, 18% in 2001. So the challenges, now to sum up, the challenges is unsafe roads, accessibility and inequality issues, increasing private motorization, insufficient public transport capacity, and greenhouse gas emissions and low air quality. So the next step is to develop scenarios for 2030. Basically, we chose 3 scenarios: the do-nothing scenario, where no investments in public transportation happen, no investment for infrastructure for active travel on local level, and the planned scenario where just the metropolitan level projects like the metro lines and the monorail get constructed, but with no further measures or interventions on a local level in the city, and the sustainable scenario where we put our realistic target to 2030. So if we look at the differences in modal share classified by the scale of the trip, the intra-district trip from 0 to 2 kilometers, the intercity or intra-city trip within this different districts from 2 to 10, and the short commutes from 10 to 30 kilometers, and long commutes more than 30 kilometers. We see that the do-nothing scenario will see basically no change in terms of percentage, but a very high increase in the actual numbers of trips conducted by private motorization. And in the planned scenario, we see the same, except for the long commutes and short commutes that will have BRT and monorail and metro lines contributing to a modal shift from paratransit and from private vehicles to use the new infrastructure, public transport, high quality infrastructures, but we will see no change in terms of intra-city trips. For the sum scenario, we are looking for maximizing the active travel in trips under 10 kilometers long, and minimize the dominance of the paratransit over the long and short commutes, and improve the capacity of the formal transport or formal bus services to support the BRT and monorail to take from the private cars, which we try to limit to lower the percentages to 10% instead of 23% in the do-nothing scenario. So those are the targets of the sustainable scenario. We want to limit the growth of trips by private vehicles to 40%, limit the rise of greenhouse gas to 7% compared to around 75% for the do-nothing scenario, and score a 40% increase in the trips by active travel modes within 6th of October city, and prioritize mass transport in the streets. So we're talking about dedicated lanes, better frequencies, and better travel times competitive with the private transportation. So the themes of the vision is accessible and safe and inclusive urban mobility experience for all through competitive, integrated and smart mass transportation and streets that promote walking and cycling. We try to achieve safer streets, integrated streets where people can use different modes in their journey without taking their private cars, attractive active travel, competitive and available mass transportation, and digital transformation, because basically we want to make the data available on the network itself. So to make those targets smart, we opted to quantify them. So we want to decrease the number of accidents by 30% from the baseline, increase satisfaction rate of internal mass transport services by 30%, improve the active travel and public transportation modal share in general, while lowering the private cars modal share to 11%, reduce the travel time gap between public transport and private cars to 30%, while we aim for a 170,000 trips offered by public transport modes by 2030, and limit the greenhouse gases to 7%. So those numbers were based on a simplified four-step model. It's not a very good four-step model, but it is a simplified model based on the questions we asked the people in the passenger survey that included origin and destination, their modal choices for up to 4 trips per day, and their satisfaction level over different sides of the transportation service: safety, comfort, and coverage, geographic coverage, travel times, and affordability. So basically, we try to include the
Rahman, can I just, you've got 3 minutes left. Can you wrap?
Yeah, thank you for the heads up. So basically, we came up with a final list of projects that targets improving mass transport and active travel in general, and minimize the gap between private and public transportation modes. And we conducted this phase during COVID-19 and the first wave of COVID-19 in 2020. So we opted for an online appraisal survey for different options for measures for 6 October citizens, and we tried to balance between the availability of resources, the acceptance of the public, and whether the measures are applicable or not. And we came up with the final package of 10 measures that included improvement of public transportation, improvement of active travel, and passenger information system. Finally, I will just end with some lessons learned from the process. Basically, the governing bodies, the local government in Egypt is mostly executives. They are not governors, they are not elected. So we have the problem that they are executives hired by the central government to run a specific urban agglomeration. So we had this struggle with bringing the public opinion on the table, because basically the governor tries to actually impress the central government rather than get a satisfaction of of the citizens of the city. And we have a limited experience within the government itself to sustain any plan or sustain any project. So they will be over relied on help from the consultants and from international organizations, and they don't even have the capacity to unlock the green finance opportunities allocated for Egypt, because basically they are struggling with the planning capacity. They are very good in implementation, they are very bad in planning. So that's why we believe that challenging them, trying to challenge them and to plan with them can actually contribute to a better governance schemes of whether to new urban communities in Egypt or even the old historic towns. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. So now we'll go into the Q&A part of the webinar. So if you have any further questions, please do pop them in the chat. I think I will go back to Tara and maybe just ask you, I know you've answered quite a number of questions in the chat already, but it would be interesting for you to reflect on some of those questions. And I think maybe the first one around how, what is the best way to effectively apply vehicle emissions control in Johannesburg, given the current challenges in terms of spatial form and the apartheid legacy and the spatial patterns? What are some of the interventions that were considered in changing this?
Great, thanks, Jahan. Yeah, I think that was a really good question, and also highlights the sensitivities that we need to be aware of. So, on one hand, on sort of the technical side, the idea of vehicles is cross-cutting, particularly if you're looking at vehicle emissions. It's cross-cutting within the city, but also in terms of the different tiers of government that we have in South Africa. So it's very it's really needed from a technical perspective to ensure that you're holistically looking at the issue. So involving not only your specific department within the city, but as I mentioned, other departments within the city, but also other tiers of government. And that's just from the technical aspect. But then you have the apartheid legacy and more of the social aspects to vehicles and implementing vehicle emissions control strategies. And that's why, we were really supportive of the City of Johannesburg's view of having a really deep stakeholder engagement plan around these specific interventions. There are a number of legacy issues that, need to be tackled when you're looking at implementing vehicle emissions control strategies. And from the perspective of a city, it's important to tackle these right from the beginning and really to be open and honest to their communities in terms of the types of interventions they're looking at, and to really listen to what some of the socioeconomic impacts of implementation of those interventions could be. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no easy answer and there's no quick win in terms of an intervention that can be implemented that ticks all the boxes from a technical aspect, but also from a socioeconomic aspect. But yeah, being able to engage as a city right from the beginning really does assure you of considering implementation actions that are actually implementable within your space.
Thanks so much for that. And I think, there's a question around what does mobility mean besides vehicle transportation? And I think the interesting part about the Johannesburg process and integrating the different stakeholders and really understanding the policy landscape was drawing together what the urban planning units were doing with the vehicle emissions and air quality, and then with transportation. And I think a big thing around reducing congestion and really rethinking our mobility systems is around planning as well. So what are the measures we can put in place to reduce emissions in terms of vehicles, but also the planning aspect and how that plays a role in sort of transforming the spatial form as well. So that was really interesting. Maybe Benjamin, there was a question around the sort of the financial model and sort of reducing risk. It says, yeah, how does the sort of financial mechanisms reduce the risk to increase the deficit to avoid not to repay the debt?
Not sure I understand the second part of that question, but certainly the first part is essentially to say, okay, well, how do you, in both cases, reduce the risk for the commercial providers of debt? So in both cases, both on, as I said, on the lease financing of the bike, and then in terms of the expansion financing for manufacturers, the issue is that these are unproven technologies. There is a lack of history, there is a lack of collateral, and there is no faith, if you like, in the end owner of the debt. And so really what we're proposing to use is the NAMA facility grant money, which is obviously high risk appetite because it's grant, pricing that commercially, but nevertheless, kind of it has a high appetite for risk. So we use it, if you like, to de-risk participation for the commercial provider. So on the lease side, we guarantee the loan up to 80% in the first years of the fund, and we ramp that down over time. And then in terms of the manufacturing or the rotating fund, it is the primary loss account, and we forecasted blending lending according to, in the first instance, 75% grant with 25% from commercial providers, and again, kind of ramping that down over time as collateral and historicals kind of become proven. So it's really around just de-risking to allow the commercial sector to crowd in.
Thanks. There was another question from Frederick Goya. So it mentioned, have you ever thought of a hybrid motors, since the batteries can run out of charge anywhere or charge away from the recharge station? So I'm just, in terms of the technology considered, the approaches in terms of charging stations, what was sort of that approach and thought around that?
So the consideration of the technology is not something that we've looked at. Our intervention has come about as we've seen a technology that is commercially viable and that is having certainly early stage success. So the technological considerations were done long before our involvement by the entrepreneurs themselves. I think the practicalities of a hybrid bike are, frankly, I don't think it would work from a weight and space perspective. The reason you can afford to get away with it in a car is because there's obviously that much more space to deal with, which I just don't think is feasible on a motorcycle. I think the reason that it works so well, kind of in a Kigalian center, is that the 90% of the trips, are very, very short distances. So it's actually not really that difficult to ride it around, and with even that kind of comparatively small range.
Thanks. Maybe a question for Natasha. In terms of this project and its links to the socioeconomic outcomes and job creation and inclusivity, sort of how can this sort of contribute and progress those elements, I think, within this project?
I think in quite a number of ways. One of our missions as FUNAWA is to increase green jobs that are available beyond just the mission at large of the country to reduce poverty and provide employment. So I think the unique element rather of including green jobs within that is something that this project directly affects. And I think when it does come to that point, I think it'll be a good addition to that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks so much. Maybe I can ask Abdurrahman. So you've gone on this SUMP process, which it's a sort of a European model that was implemented in Cairo and in the 6th of October city. What would be your advice or suggestions for cities that want to embark on this process? What are the things that they sort of need to put in place, or in terms of data, or what are the challenges? So yeah, what would you suggest for those cities?
Thank you, Ivan. First of all, I think the developing internal technical capacity to select from very wide range of options, technical options, transport infrastructures. There are many options for cities to develop a better public transport and micro mobility options. The problem is they are often, we see it with the monorail lines in Cairo. The public discussion around the project has been very minimal. There has been very critical voices from academics and from experts on the monorail itself. However, the deals are made based on who is better in pitching their transport infrastructure. So I think the technical, from working with the government in Egypt, developing an internal technical capacity is a key to choose from a very wide range of options to improve the overall urban agglomeration mobility, which might be a tactical urbanism approach to make a very low cost intervention to test, to a very large investment like a new metro line. But you have to have these objectives on a city level, not just the idea of constructing a line that has a capacity of 500,000 trips or passengers per day, and then you find out that actually it only carries a fraction of this number because you didn't choose well at the first place. So building the capacity internally is a key, the technical capacity and the managerial capacity to unlock the funding options, especially green finance options that Egypt has been lacking in terms of unlocking because of structural issues and the availability of experts inside the government itself.
Thanks so much. So we have to wrap up now at the moment. And I see there's still quite a number of questions, but however, I think we can pose these to the speakers and have them answered potentially during email or something. But I would just like to thank all of the speakers here today, to all of the participants who've really been engaging and pushing forward some of these really interesting questions. There's a comment around, the projects have been really, the presentations have been really impeccable in terms of the research and the work that has gone into it. And I think it's really interesting and very exciting to see all the developments happening around the continent. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who will close us off. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jahan, and thanks, colleagues, for the wonderful insights that you shared from different contexts. I don't know if I'm the most appropriate person to wrap this up, but I see in the chat a comment from our colleague Sizwe, who's remarked, from Johannesburg to Rwanda to Egypt, it seems the common problems, social inequality, poor infrastructure, rapid urbanization, and notably an immense gap between planning, governance, and implementation. And I think what struck me as a golden thread through each of these presentations were how different entry points are attempting to address planning, governance, and implementation. Notably to me, the point again on evidence-informed process, seeing a model looking at vehicle emissions, a life cycle analysis demonstrating the value of transitioning from one form of motor to another, and then a great survey process around what modes of transportation could be most effectively implemented in 6th of October City. So I want this conversation to go on, as I think many people in the questions have remarked. And particularly notably, we've spoken a lot about transport, but my question might be, and a few presentations hinted at it, how do these transport modes, what support do these transport modes need from wider infrastructure and planning thought? So I know we'll share the recording and a digest of this, and I hope we'll be speaking soon about how these projects can learn further from each other. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined this conversation. I hope you all stay well and look forward to engaging again soon. Bye, everybody.